right, these are your kingdom fungi video notes. So this is going to get into the specifics of this next kingdom and our eukaryote theme. So first of all, just some major characteristics. Fungi can be unicellular or multicellular. They're eukaryotic, heterotrophs, meaning they have to consume other organisms for food. They're decomposers, and their cell walls are composed of chitin, which is different than plants, which have cellulose. Some key important structures then, in general, there's a very high surface area to volume ratio, which means that there's a large area, imagine a mushroom, but there's not much volume. They're not very heavy, they're not very complex. There's also parts within this fungi. So there's something called the hyphae. This provides just a larger surface area and allows for better nutrient absorption. It's also specifically adapted for growth on solid surfaces, which is why oftentimes you see fungi pop up in places where you may not have expected them. Next up is mycelium. So this is the net-like mass that's formed from the hyphae, and then the fruiting body itself is that spore-bearing above-ground portion of the fungi. And we'll look at a picture so you can kind of see these different things. So the hyphae are above ground. The hyphae then are the above-ground portion. And the fruiting body is this whole upper part here is the fruiting body. So all of this is the hyphae, and then all of this is the mycelium. When we continue talking about the structure, septa is also an important term you need to understand. So septa are those cross walls that divide the hyphae. Now there's two types of fungi. There's septate fungi, which have the septa, and then there's aseptate, which don't have it. So if you look at the difference here, the septate fungi versus the aseptate fungi. Fungi also get their nutrition in various forms. So like I had mentioned, they're all heterotrophs, but they have different ways of consuming food. So some of them are saprotrophic, meaning they're decomposers. They recycle nutrients from dead organisms. There's also parasitic fungi, which absorb nutrients from the living cells of another organism. And then mutualistic. Some fungi do live in a mutualistic relationship, and this is with another organism, not always a fungi. It could be a plant or something like that, which we'll get into in a minute. So they also reproduce differently. So there's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. In terms of sexual reproduction, spores are the only way that they reproduce sexually. But asexually, they do go through budding, fragmentation, and spore production can also be an asexual method. The spore production itself then consists of an asexual and the sexual life cycle of most fungi. The spores are released, which begins the life cycle again, and they reproduce two different ways based on this. So heterophilic reproduction is with an opposite mating type, and this is meiosis, is how these fungi are produced. Homophilic then is with itself, and this is through mitosis. So these are essentially a clone of the parent or the asexual form of reproduction. A sporophore then is the fruiting body of the fungus, and this fruiting body is the structure that contains those spores. These are very good adaptations for survival, and the classification of fungi is based on the type of sporophore. Now, if you remember from protists, we talked about all the different ways that protists are classified. So it's important to make note here then that fungi are classified based on their type of sporophore. There's also some interesting methods of spore release. So in most fungi, there's going to be a fluid buildup that affects the cell volume and causes those spores to just be ejected. But there's a few other methods. Things like bird nest fungi, which has water drops of spores. Puffballs are enclosed until the fruiting body dries out, and then there's a big smoke puff when they escape. And then stinkhorns. These actually smell very bad, which is why they're called stinkhorns, and they attract insects because they smell like dung or animal waste. The insects are then transporting the spores everywhere else. In terms of asexual reproduction, so for budding, a new cell just develops while still attached to the parent cell. The plasma membrane then pinches off, and it separates the new cell and the parent cell. And a really common example of this is yeast cells, which you see in this picture. As they're budding off, they form more and more cells. For fragmentation, this is a little different because in this case, the mycelia is going to break into fragments. Those fragments then land all over, and if they land in a location that's suitable, they're going to grow and make new mycelia. This is really common in fungi that have lost the ability to produce spores, such as foot fungus, for example. So let's look now at the classification of fungi. So there are 5 major phylums or phyla that we're going to talk about, and we'll get into each one of these and just some examples as well. So here's a look at the ancestry of them. As you can see, basidiomycota and ascomycota are the 2 most recent species, and they all share a common ancestor with zygomycota and chytridiomycota. So first up is phylum chytridiomycota. So the chytrids, these are unicellular and most of them are aquatic. Some of them can be saprotrophic, but they do produce flagellated spores. So here we go, we're talking about how their spores are formed, which is why they're classified. These, interestingly enough, used to be classified as protists because they were unicellular. They were originally classified there instead of with the fungi. And this could also be that evolutionary link between protists and fungi. Next up is phylum zygomycota. These are the common molds. So as you can see in this picture up here of bread, when you see moldy bread, you think of common mold. Most of them are terrestrial, and they can form a mutualistic relationship with plants. They reproduce both sexually and asexually, and the molds form different types of hyphae. So there's things called stolons and rhizoids. So stolons are what spread across the food surface, which is what you see with mold, and then the rhizoids are going to penetrate the food to absorb the nutrients from the food. And here's just a look at the life cycle. If I were you, I'd pause this here and either sketch this or screenshot it and print it out, but you're definitely going to want to have a copy of this life cycle in your notes. Next up then is phylum ascomycota. These are referred to as sac fungi, and most of them are multicellular, although there are some unicellular species such as yeast. They can live in a variety of habitats, and they can be saprophytic, parasitic, or mutualistic. And once again, they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Now, there are some beneficial and harmful examples of the sac fungi. So beneficial, some truffles. Yeast is what's used to make bread, wine, and beer, and then genetic research for vaccines has also used some of these sac fungi. Harmful examples, on the other hand, are things like Dutch elm disease, any blue-green, red, or brown food molds you see, and something called apple scab, which is another disease. Next, we're going to talk about phylum basidiomycota. So these are known as the club fungi, also known as mushrooms. Mostly multicellular and mostly terrestrial. Once again, they occupy all different kinds of the feeding niches, and they rarely reproduce asexually, which makes them a little bit different from the ones we've been talking about. They are also the major decomposers of wood. They produce something then called a basidiocarp, or a fruiting body, and the underside of the cap has basidia. So if you look at this picture here, it shows the cap, and then you see the basidia. And that is where the gills are, and the spores form in the gills. So the fruiting body is very important for the reproduction of these fungi. Lastly, we're going to talk about phylum deuteromycota. These are referred to as the imperfect fungi, and they don't have an observed sexual stage, which is kind of also why they're classified as imperfect. They do have asexual spores, though, and they are a very diverse group. But they also might not be considered a true phylum. For now, we're considering them a phylum, but you never know, in a few years, we might find out otherwise. And then examples of these imperfect fungi are things like penicillin, yeast infections, athlete's foot, the fungi that's actually used to make foods like soy sauce, blue cheese, and citric acid, which is in a lot of soda, jellies, and candies. So imperfect fungi are very important to some food items that we like, but they also kind of cause some not so nice infections. Fungi also exist in symbiotic relationships, so lichens and mycorrhizae. Now, lichens is between fungus and an algae, and the mycorrhizae is between fungus and plant roots. So the algae is providing food for the fungus and itself with lichens, and the fungus then provides that hyphae for the algae to grow. Mycorrhizae, on the other hand, the fungus is going to absorb the minerals for the plant, and the hyphae increases the surface area of the plant. So the fungi gets the carbs and amino acids that it needs from the plants, but then the plant has a larger root surface area, which helps it grow better and more lush. So here's a closer look at the lichens. So like I mentioned, the fungi provide the web for the algae to grow. The algae then produce sugars for both of them to eat, and lichens are very resilient. As you know from the ecology theme, we talked about They're sometimes the first species to inhabit areas of primary succession where there was not previously an environment. They can also be bioindicators, so they are very sensitive to environmental changes, especially different air pollutants. Mycorrhizae, on the other hand, like we talked about, is plants and fungus. So it results in very healthy and more vigorous plants. And you can see both of these pictures here shows without and with. And once again, over here, we see the same thing. There's also some benefits of fungi. So most people sometimes think of fungi as bad, but bioremediation, they are so important for recycling nutrients throughout the environment. They kind of clean up the dead trees and the dead animals, and they help cycle those nutrients back into the ground, as we saw with the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the carbon cycle. They're all very important to the cycling of matter. They're also important in medicine. So fungi is actually a source of penicillin, and it can also do things like reduce high blood pressure and promote contractions during childbirth. And then lastly, we eat it. So a lot of people like mushrooms, yeast, alcohol, and cheese are all foods that are a beneficial part of fungi. But as we know, it can also be harmful. So harmful fungi can destroy plants and crops, such as the American elm trees. And there's also parasitic fungi. So we'll watch a video in class about fungi invading ants, but they infect insects and then they kill them. And then also just things like nasty, gross stuff we get, right? Athlete's foot, ringworm, yeast infections. Fungi can cause all of these things. And that is it for your notes.